Hello, and welcome to the Autistic Me Podcast. I am Christopher Scott Wyatt, speaking as the Autistic Me. Today on the podcast, we're being joined by Kate McNulty. McNulty is a licensed clinical social worker and certified relationship therapist through the Gottman Institute of Seattle, Washington. She is a certified sex therapist and member of the American Association of Sex Educators, Counselors, and Therapists. You can learn more about McNulty on her website, autistictherapist.com. And if you couldn't guess by the URL of the website, McNulty herself identifies as an autistic individual. McNulty is the author of Love and Asperger's, Practical Strategies to Help Couples Understand Each Other and Strengthen Their Connection. Love and Asperger's is published under the Rockridge Press imprint of Callisto Media, and it is available on Amazon. Welcome to the show, Ms. McNulty.
Thanks for inviting me today. I'm really pleased to learn about your show and to be a guest. Thanks again.
Let's talk a little bit about what brings you as an autistic individual into therapy. You identified as autistic later, after you were already a therapist.
Yes, quite a bit later in life. Only through learning from my clients about autism did I start to realize that family members of mine are autistic. And then as I got more informed, I realized I'm autistic myself.
And so you were already working as a therapist. That seems like a very interesting career path based on some of the assumptions about autistic individuals.
Yeah, I appreciate you using that word assumptions because I think there are a lot of stereotypes about what autistic people can do and how we operate. And I'm surprised at how many therapists are autistic or wonder whether they're autistic. I think it's a career where we need to do a lot of sitting back and observing other people, and that for many of us is a very natural state if we're autistic. So having this aptitude for being perceptive and observant is something that's common to many of us. Although I think the stereotypes tend to be that people think that autistic folks are not emotional, don't understand feelings, don't convey much feeling. That's quite inaccurate.
That power of observation, that interest you have in looking at and taking in the information, would you describe that then as a benefit to how you approach being a therapist?
Yeah, I think that there are a lot of strengths that autistic people can bring to this field. Another is that we tend to be lifelong learners. We're just very intellectually curious and really like to get to the bottom of things and get a thorough understanding about quite a broad variety of topics. So, having that curiosity about how people think and wanting to learn and understand about people who may be different from us is a trait that really brings a strength to somebody who is in this field as an autistic.
According to your website and your profile on the book cover, you are a certified sex therapist. When my wife and I address groups, one of the very common questions is, do you have a normal relationship? They never quite want to ask the question directly,
Hmm.
but
Hmm.
the physical intimacy that is assumed not to exist does exist for autistics.
Hmm.
Can you comment on that? You deal with physical intimacy and relationship intimacy, both as an autistic and helping other autistics. Could you explain how those assumptions about sexuality and gender just don't quite match what the autistic experience can be?
I think a lot of the misinformation that's out there is from people who have been observing autistic people and going by their outward appearance, and not until the last probably 10 or 15 years in the advent of the internet, we didn't have much information about what autistic adults thought and felt like. But now we have this kind of flowering of a lot of writing and like this media that you're doing, podcasts, blogs, all kinds of ways that autistic adults can get their thoughts and perceptions out into the world. And so we're learning more and more all the time from this generous outpouring of information. There was, I think, a time when it was commonly assumed that autistic people, for some reason, it began with identifying children as being autistic, or it was originally called Asperger's. And so adults were looking at these children and making up all kinds of stories about what they had going on internally and believing that they were robotic or even less than human. but we now know a lot more about autistic children who grow into being autistic adults. They don't outgrow their autism, and that autistic adults have a very rich inner world most times and have imaginative experience and long for connection and have the capacity for connection and intimacy that everybody else does. It's just not as evident because for many of us, our presentation is kind of muted. Many autistic people tend to be quieter or might speak in a flatter tone of voice. So it's not as apparent to others that we too have a rich variety of emotions and a breadth of emotional experience.
You mentioned some of the assumptions that are made coming from the past and the media. Obviously, the best known autistic figures are fictional
Hmm.
or they are media presentations of individuals.
Hmm.
Knowing some of the autistic scholars that I've met at conferences and elsewhere, assumptions are made because they may or may not be married. They may be content, not displaying affection, or as you said, sounding detached.
Hmm.
But those media presentations then reinforce the idea that they are content, alone, isolated, without companionship.
Hmm.
That shortchanges the autistic community.
I think so too. And I think that some of it does come from a realistic experience of being perhaps content with the life of the mind. Some of us are so passionate and consumed by certain interests we have or things that bring us joy that we can take those pleasures independently. We don't really need another person. But I'll tell you, I don't think there's anything like the delight of two or more autistic people enthusing about the things that they're interested in and having fun, lively conversations about sharing their passions. And I hear this phrase, special interests. I think that's pretty condescending, but we have intense interests, most of us. That's one of the markers of being autistic. So having that enjoyment of sharing and learning from other people is one of the ways that we tend to socialize and that we find very gratifying.
Let's talk a little bit about your book, Love and Asperger's. Tensions often occur when you have a neurotypical and a neurodiverse partner or partners in the relationship. Can you explain why do you think that tends to be difficult?
I think there are some places where there's going to be awkwardness or misunderstanding in that kind of match. And that's the audience for the book. The book is about relationships where one person is autistic, or Asperger's is the term the publisher preferred to use because that's what people search for when they're looking for information about adults. A person with Asperger's or autism gets together with a partner who's neurotypical. And there are just certain traits and tendencies that are likely to lead to misunderstandings or miscommunication. But I also think, like you were just saying, there are these media portrayals, cliches, and stereotypes about us that give people an assumption that we are not affectionate. Or, tragically, I even have found search terms come up on internet searches like, are people with Asperger's capable of love? That's a dreadful question to ever even raise. Of course, we're fully human. We are very loving in the right circumstances. And just like anybody, we're capable of attachment and connection. So there are a lot of things working against the autistic partner, and giving the neurotypical person affirmation that they're fine. They know everything about relationship and their autistic partner is unequipped or unfeeling. Part of my message that I wanted to send by writing this book is that that's an unfortunate mistake to think that way, and that often, especially as I was just saying about these intense interests, often the autistic partner is making attempts to connect, sharing information, maybe seeking to do something to make life convenient for their neurotypical partner, or researching a medical problem they have, or trying to look up directions to a place they know they need to get to. They're trying to do things that are kindnesses in the neurodivergent way, the autistic way, but the neurotypical person doesn't recognize that's a love offering that they're making.
I often hear that the neurotypical partner has to make accommodations for the autistic individual.
Hmm.
And I think that simplifies things because every relationship between any two people is a set of compromises and negotiations.
Mm-hmm.
And the assumption that the autistic can't or won't learn or be able to compromise reduces us to children.
Mm-hmm.
It makes us less than whole, mature adult partners. I would like to think that my wife and I compromise on a regular basis.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why we have been together and how we approach life. Could you comment on the assumption that in some ways the neurotypical partner is supposed to somehow be the lead and the example and almost the mentor in the relationship, when that in itself seems to be a condescending description of relationships?
Yeah, I'm sad to tell you, if you just look online, you'll find many, many forums and chat rooms where the neurotypical partner is there to complain and vent about their autistic partner. And I would even use the word martyr. There's a sense that people are saddled with this unfeeling, uninformed partner, and they need to bring them along or coach or guide them, or they're just putting up with this person's quirks and weirdnesses. It's a very hostile atmosphere in some of these forums. And so that's another reason that I was enthusiastic about the opportunity to write this book, because it's a chance to correct some of these misunderstandings and mistaken notions. I think that really, you're absolutely right. It's very clear from the research, all intimate relationships require many, many instances of compromise, and that compromise is being made on both sides. So, some of what we need to help couples learn is they need to recognize where they are likely to have some pitfalls or obstacles just because of communication styles, social preferences, sensory needs, just certain values and beliefs that might be in collision, and have some language about those. Having some capacity to reach compromise or try to understand one another is, you're halfway down the road if you can just do that part. But I think part of the sad thing about these books I see and some of the online sites where people can go for resources about their autistic partner is that they're feeding into this lopsided situation where one person is, the neurotypical person is supposed to be okay. They've got things figured out. They know how to be in a relationship, and their autistic partner seems to them to be sadly unequipped. So I would like to do something to change that idea and bring both people along to recognize they both have their own strengths, and they can appreciate their differences and find some way that they can help one another, because the autistic person also is a resource to their neurotypical partner, has many positive traits and plenty that they can contribute to the relationship.
Let's talk a little bit about communication style. When I am addressing parents or partners of autistics, one of the complaints is the autistic communication style being blunt, factual, and being perceived as hurtful.
Hmm.
I have to imagine that if that's coming up to speakers like myself when I'm addressing audiences, that as a therapist, you must hear that same complaint, that the partner is very direct, lacking nuance, lacking subtlety. And so there's a communication difference that where the autistic is seen as almost abrasive.
Hmm.
How can we address those concerns and work on being better communicators together as partners?
Yeah, I think for the neurotypical partner to recognize that their autistic mate may have a more practical, concrete way of thinking about things and wants to just get their point across, maybe trying to be helpful, but saying things in a way that may appear blunt or overly direct. Having that awareness is a step right there. But then for the autistic person also to recognize they can develop some skills. They can develop some softening of the way they present things, or they can offer more affection to their partner in various forms, in terms of not just saying I love you more often or saying romantic things, but leaving tokens for their partner, showing considerateness, having some ways of reaching out to their partner at regular intervals, say during their workday when they're apart, so that their partner knows they continue to think of them and cherish them. We all need these little touches and reassurances. And so for the neurotypical person to get that on a more kind of a drip basis, on a more regular basis with frequency, that's likely to help them feel that their partner's on their side and not oppositional or critical of them. This is a pattern we do tend to see in these, what I call mixed neurotype relationships, but these are struggles for all kinds of couples anyway. These are things that many, many couples need to work on and pay attention to. There's a way that autistic people like to explain things and be very clear and explicit when they're talking. And sometimes that's seen as, or I should say, heard as pedantic by the neurotypical partner, like they're acting in a superior way or they're trying to act like they're the teacher. But again, I think accommodating one another's styles and recognizing there's not necessarily any kind of contempt associated with that. It's just a stylistic difference. There's nothing wrong or right about it being either more specific and precise in one's speech versus more casual and assuming understanding. There's no one wrong there. It's just a matter of recognizing the other person has this tendency and you want to take it in the right spirit.
A device you discuss in the text, and one that my wife and I have used for as long as we've known each other, the keeping of lists or the making of lists together. We find that when we have a discussion, it helps to be listing out the points and the goals. Otherwise, everything seems like a priority or everything seems like a concern. As where if we make a list, that list forces me to put things in a ranked order, and that lets her know what's really the first priority, the second priority, etc. And it can be as simple as our new house, we're thinking about landscaping. Well, do we want to do the front, the back? Do we want to do the trees first, or do we want to do the patio first? And by keeping a list and then together negotiating the items on the list, we're able to come to a clearer understanding, because I might just say, I want a patio. But what I'm really thinking is, I wouldn't mind having it after the trees, after the irrigations, etc. So the list gives me a concrete way to organize my thoughts and come to a better understanding. And I like the fact that you mentioned lists in your text several times.
Many of us autistics have some degree of sensory processing difficulty, so we may have difficulty retaining what's said in a conversation and hanging on to the words and concepts. They kind of spill over us and sometimes we lose track. So having that visual cue and something that anchors us in the conversation can be helpful. It's also a way to just make things more objective. It's the list acts as kind of a witness for the conversation. And so using something like that gives a sense of collaboration and that both people are active participants in the conversation. The other difficulty that autistics are more likely to have than the general population is many of us have ADHD. And so having that sense of overwhelm, or as you just mentioned, difficulty sifting what's important and what's not. You're kind of looking at the whole field or hearing everything in the whole conversation simultaneously. Your brain doesn't easily differentiate the parts that are the priorities or the highlights. And so having that kind of multimedia experience of conversing and listing things and maybe doodling or sketching something out at the same time that you're talking gives both people a way to feel mutual involvement. And it's kind of like putting labels on the conversation as you go along. So both people can stay oriented. So there's a sense of shared involvement and pleasure and togetherness in that kind of discussion.
I have been a fan of the personal digital assistant since the Palm Pilot.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that we do is create shared calendars, shared events, shared lists. And so when I create a list, my wife Susan can go in and rearrange it or make notes. And if she makes a list, I can then make notes too. And in some ways, that allows us to communicate without being verbal all the time, without the stress of the face to face, looking at each other, trying to read things. It's something that not everyone understands, and they'll think, well, we're being distant or we're not really talking to each other. But by using that PDA, I'm able to maintain those lists on, now it's the iPhone.
Mhm.
And, my wife can go in there and say, oh, our landscaping checklist. Well, let's move the trees up, the shrubs down. Or with the kids, we might move what we're doing with the kids for the week. We might change, okay, we're going to do science project on this day instead of on Tuesday or Thursday instead of Wednesday. And so we collaborate, but we don't have to sit at a table. And in some ways, that reduces the stress of trying to negotiate in real time. Doing it asynchronously where we can each pause and reflect seems to make it less prone to conflict.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense what you're saying. And I think it's also allowing for that possible difference in processing time, that autistic people might be the ones who are more likely to need to step back from the conversation and, as you say, have a reflective moment or consider things independently without the stimulation of their partner, perhaps sitting and waiting expectantly for their response. So that's some of the value of what you're describing in this system, is that it allows each person to dip into this topic with their own attention when they have time and they can focus. It's also, though, I think, a very lovely way to feel a sense of continuity and moving through time together. If these documents are there for either of you to ponder or comment on at your convenience, it means that you're having that sense of thinking about one another, even. I mean, we're not apart that much probably during the pandemic, but even in ordinary circumstances when we might be physically separated, it gives us that feeling that we're still thinking of a topic together, or we're thinking of our partner and their point of view as we're maybe making a note or commenting on that material that you're talking about. So, having both people have the pleasure of conversation with these sort of aids and structures, I don't think it's a real stretch for most neurotypical people to do that. And it actually really expands the possibilities about how you can talk productively and have a pleasant sense about the subject, even though it might involve the stresses of decision making or, budgeting and expense associated with a project. But you both still get to share it together and think about it without that kind of intense demand of like, let's talk now, or we need to decide now.
One of the phrases you use is sync, being an out of sync couple or getting your calendars in sync, getting your lives in sync. What do you mean by synchronizing as a couple?
I think something that, most modern couples have to manage is just demanding schedules and overwhelm. But this is much magnified with a relationship with an autistic partner, because one of the markers of being autistic is people who are capable under certain circumstances, people who can function quite well given perhaps optimal or preferable conditions, but who can't always do that. For some of us, if we've had a poor night's sleep, or we're stressed about something, or we're dealing with pain, anything that detracts from our full capacity to think, we're just not equipped in the same way all the time. We're more variable in our functioning than neurotypical people. So getting in sync might mean here's somewhere where there may truly be some accommodations that the neurotypical needs to make to the autistic. Because if we're overwhelmed or overstimulated or worried about something, we're not going to be top notch. And so a neurotypical person just has more bounce. They have more resilience. They have more capacity to endure and tolerate adversity without any of that affecting their performance. So that's a way that the neurotypical person has the advantage when it comes to the demands, the day to day demands of contemporary life. But it might just mean that the autistic partner needs some time to catch up, or they might need a little downtime or a day home alone so that they can recharge their batteries and get back to where they can solve complicated problems or tackle stressful situations.
Obviously, a problem during the pandemic has been having any sort of activities on the calendar. You mentioned the value of date nights, movie nights, things set aside for couples, some sort of routine where it's predictable, it's comfortable, you know what it's coming. So it's this scheduled time together to reinforce and build the relationship. But we're all stuck at home.
Hmm.
There is no date night. There is no dinner together. There is no movie on the couch time. The kids are always around. We are always around each other. There is no alone time. How should we be looking at that, even if it's only for another 6 months?
Mhm.
That still is a problem for couples.
Only another 6 months still sounds like an eternity.
It does.
Yeah, and I mean, I think there's a disorientation that we're all experiencing because the days are largely the same. It doesn't particularly even matter for many of us whether it's a weekend or what time of year it is. And so we lose our bearings when we don't have those markers in time of holidays we can look forward to or celebrations or special events. So having that attitude of something being special is very difficult right now because we can't have anything out of the ordinary happen. There's no way to get together with other people or leave our homes without certain precautions being taken. So I think the tedium is wearing on all kinds of people. In some ways, maybe autistics are better adapted because we tend to prefer routine. Many of us really value having some sort of steadiness and predictability about life. Of course, this is a bit much what we're all going through right now. But I think that an autistic person may, by disposition, have more patience for it and more ability to contain their impatience about wanting to get back to the hubbub of day to day life. I think, in terms of couples, really having some routines for parents, I think it's crucial to have routines where they can count on parent time away from their children, even if that means more time where the kids have screens and the parents are upstairs taking a nap together or doing something intimate or just having some protected adult time. One of the most common concerns I see for all couples with children is that they get so focused on their role as parents that they lose track of who they are as married people. And so that's a particular drawback of the pandemic because everyone's got this 100% 24-hour a day childcare responsibility. It becomes extremely difficult to remember that you are a person. You're an adult with your own thoughts and your own autonomy. Taking a walk with your partner where you deliberately say, like, let's not talk about the kids, or we're not going to talk about school or, the homework on this walk. We're going to have one walk every Saturday morning, maybe, where we just go and talk about ourselves or ask each other questions or think about current events or whatever we wish to without this parental role following us around wherever we go.
And now that's not possible because you can't leave the kids anywhere. There's no
Mm-hmm.
one to watch the
Mm-hmm.
kids.
Right. Yes. And everyone has to be in isolation to be really safe.
Even under the best of circumstances, there are challenges to having these nights together, these times together. The autistic individual may have one or two favorite places to go, comfortable places to go, or a particular type of place where he or she can thrive.
Mhm.
And so even that becomes a challenge. My wife and I would scout out restaurants or places that we might go before deciding, yeah, let's try that dinner, let's try that particular shop or whatever. And there were times when we would arrive at a restaurant that had been quiet when we first looked at it. When we arrived for the actual meal, it's like, no, there's just no way. It's too loud. There's
Mhm.
too much sensory overload. That, of course, would be disappointing for any couple. I know it's not easy. My wife and I will go somewhere and I'll say, it's just too loud. I cannot function in this setting. Let's try to find something else. So, how do you navigate those situations where the autistic does have special needs that do limit some of the relationship norms, like movies, like concerts? There are things I just cannot do easily.
Yeah, we have legitimate sensory needs, many of us, and it does mean that public space is not always welcoming. Reactivity to lighting is a very real thing for most of us. Actually, it's interesting you bring up restaurants. I've read that in the last 10 years or so, there's been something very deliberate going on with restaurant design to make it noisy, to minimize like wall coverings or curtains and give this sense of bustle and something lively going on, but it drives people like us out of the room. Having more noise, more clattering, more echoes just makes the idea of digesting a meal completely impossible. So, having the proper decor where we have our lighting needs attended to, where the sound might be pleasant or bubbly, but not raucous, not a din. Sometimes also smells. If someone's got too much perfume on, or, there's something else that's just aversive from a smell perspective, autistic people just can't bear staying in the space. So having those kinds of needs taken into account means that the couple has to have a pre-agreed plan about a veto power by the autistic person, to have some kind of exit strategy, a plan B, knowing that sometimes things just are not going to work out, even when you're primed for a good time and you're in a good mood and looking forward to it. If you get to the restaurant and it's crammed with people, or there's just such a shrieking sound that you couldn't enjoy being there, you've got to know, okay, we'll try this other place instead, or let's go home and do something else. The neurotypical person just has to get used to accepting that and working with that set of barriers, which again, I want to emphasize, it's something in us and our neurology that we cannot help. It's not being difficult or picky. And it's also a way that the outside world is unwelcoming to us and creates barriers that make it impossible for us to be social, even when we try oftentimes.
I've noticed that my preferences for restaurants tend to the old style steakhouses with the padded booths and the carpeting.
The booths are great.
And as you said, this move towards stainless steel and aluminum with tile floors and music playing, that shift that occurred in the 1980s and 90s.
Hmm.
I recall there was an article in the New York Times restaurant section on those redesigns. The idea that you can turn the tables faster too, that
Hmm.
people come in and then they want to get out. And in and out is good for a restaurant, but it's not really the experience I want.
Hmm.
I notice now with our daughters, especially the youngest, the one we call Anne on the podcast and the blog, Anne is very sensitive to auditory input.
Hmm.
And so going out to a restaurant, if it's loud, she becomes nearly unmanageable. So it's a good reminder that she's expressing what I have been trying to say, but a child is far more direct
Uh-huh.
about the
Uh-huh.
pain and the discomfort.
Right.
So in some ways, it's good to have those children out there saying, this hurts,
Hmm.
because they'll just bluntly tell you, I can't hear, it hurts, can we go?
Hmm.
They aren't diplomatic. Moving on, I want to touch on something that you reference in the text and that has come up quite a bit in autistic forums lately, and that is the gender and sexual diversity within the neurodiversity community. Many parents I meet are traditional, and they are concerned because they have read that autistics have a higher likelihood of not being heterosexual and normative. From the position of a social worker, what is the evidence? Are these parents, first off, I think it's a silly thing to be concerned about. So there is that. But also, the reality is, quite a few of the people I know who are transgender, polyamorous, asexual, everything across the spectrum of gender identity and sexual identity, I see within the neurodiversity community.
Hmm.
Am I misreading that?
You are absolutely accurate. I think the numbers are that in the general population, less than 2% are trans, but among autistic this is just diagnosed people, not people who are self-diagnosed, but 8 to 10% of those who've been diagnosed as autistic have expressed a wish to change gender. That's a significant difference. There are significantly larger numbers of autistic people among the LGBTQ population than statistics would predict. I think that this is also just another facet of our diversity, and that there's a way that we are more likely to be different in a number of ways than the general population. So we don't really fully understand it. It's only been recognized probably less than in the last 10 years. So there's not a lot of research that we can reference on it, but that's an accurate prediction. And I just think, for parents who are worried about that, it's time to educate yourself. If you see any of those tendencies in your kids, the number one predictor of mental health in trans kids is their parents' attitude. So parents who are worried that their kids might be trans, or they see that their kids like to play with unconventional toys or dress differently from kids of their gender, it's terribly important that you get yourself informed and seek out information, because the risk of suicide skyrockets as kids mature into puberty if they're trans, and they very much need their parents to be on their team and accepting them. We have no reason to think that we can change those traits in people. If someone's trans, that's just the way they are. They're born like that. And it's not something we can talk people out of or convert them from. It's crucial for their well-being and literal survival that their parents learn about managing this and helping them with it and being a support and a cheerleader for them.
It is difficult for many autistics because they feel rejected as autistics. And then if they are also LGBTQ plus or asexual, if they are in any way not what their parents consider heteronormative, then they are rejected yet again.
Mhm.
And so there is that twice magnified, I don't know how else to say it,
Sure.
this multiplier effect of rejection. You're autistic, so you're already broken, and now your gender identity has further alienated you.
Mhm.
One of the side effects of this that I see among the autistic adult community, for many of us, our partners and other autistics become our only family.
We do have some progress being made, I think, especially because of the efforts of the advocates that we were talking about earlier, of people who are loud and proud about being autistic. I think there's some more visibility, and visibility tends in social movements to eventually lead toward acceptance. There is still a tremendous problem with isolation and people who are autistic who get depressed and discouraged, feeling like they have several strikes against them. It's clear that in some studies that have been done within a very short period of time, maybe you remember the data, I think less than a minute, autistic people tend to get noticed and rejected by neurotypical people in social interactions. We're doing something odd and offbeat that we don't even try to do it. We can't help ourselves from doing it. And so this sense of dismissal, rejection, being shunned by the group is terribly difficult for all of us, but especially for young people. And young people who are trying to emerge and identify with something that's non normative in terms of their romantic orientation or their gender, really have an uphill climb against them and desperately need allies so that they have some guidance about how to deal with their differences, how to feel positive about who they are, how to find welcoming and safe places to be. So, we need people who are a little further down the road to act as mentors and guides. And thank goodness there's such a relentless conversation, an endless conversation going online. Anybody who has access to the internet now can tap into that, but that's still a relatively recent development. And in families where parents control their kids' access to media, they don't even have the ability to do that.
You have a chapter in the book on family. And for many of our partners, family is important to them. They have interconnected relationships with brothers, sisters, aunts, uncles. Family is very important to many people.
Mhm.
And then the flip side of that is many autistics, our families were not always a positive experience. And so the bonds aren't the same. This chapter that you've written about the value of family, sometimes it's very hard for us to process. Family bonds are different because, quite logically, I sit there and say, well, why should I feel an obligation to someone strictly out of bloodline? The other side of that is other families seem to have those bonds.
Yeah, and I mean, especially if autistic children were not treated fairly or were abused by their parents because of their behavior or behavioral differences, it's pretty difficult to want to be with them in adulthood. But I think the affinity many neurotypical people feel for their families, or the at least sense of obligation to be with them. This comes up for couples because the autistic person may be less socially inclined, may have less energy to go out and do social things outside of work. And so the neurotypical partner wants to attend every niece's birthday party or go to so and so's graduation. And the autistic partner is like, I need to be home and have some downtime or read a book or be with nature, do something that I prefer to do, not just run to one party after another. So, this kind of frenzy of socializing has been kind of characterized as a pathology of the neurotypical, right? It's kind of, we can turn the tables too and say, what's up with you who need to just be with somebody all the time and be so busy and talking so much of the time? What if the autistic person has a perfectly valid point of view and it's their neurotypical partner who's a little odd, wanting to be in this frenzy of constant activity and in company of others all the time? This is another one of those things where people have to find a way to talk about it and take it on a sort of case by case basis as these instances come up, because there's no great solution. It's just an ongoing problem of a difference in temperament, and neither partner is going to convince the other person to do things their way, because they constitutionally cannot. They're not capable of making that compromise. So helping couples have that ongoing discussion, evaluation, just keep trying to figure out, how does everyone get as many of their needs met as possible? That's about as good as it gets.
The chapter that you have on family is interesting to me. I'm thinking about couples I know where, particularly on the East Coast, I know some very traditional Italian families that really do get together every Sunday. And as the
Hmm.
family has gotten larger, as there are now grandkids and great grandkids, they still just cram more and more people around a Sunday dinner table. And this to me would be an absolute nightmare.
Mayhem.
Yes,
Yeah.
but it is so important to that family that I could see the autistic marrying into that family or having a relationship with a member of that family in utter panic, because now that they're expected to be able to understand and join in to a ritual that is important to the family and their faith and their culture, but is just overwhelming and claustrophobic for the
Hmm.
autistic.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And sometimes that autistic person ends up coping by taking one of several roles, right? Of being the person who's willing to go outside and watch the kids play to make sure everybody's safe and not having to make small talk with the other adults. Or they like to tidy the kitchen, or they're washing the dishes, or, there's some way that they're part of it, but they're not in the hubbub of it. They're not caught up in the middle of it, partly because of those sensory needs we talked about earlier, partly often because autistic people don't typically find small talk very interesting or engaging. For a lot of autistic people, the torment of making up spontaneous responses to repetitive questions is very exhausting, or talking about things that don't seem to have a lot of meaning, that appear superficial, not interesting to us. Finding a way that we can cope and be present at an event and, show up for our partner if nothing else, or just show up to say, hey, I don't know why the heck we're all here, but you people do matter to me, so let's be together. Just finding a way to have your presence send that message by getting involved in mundane tasks or spending time outdoors with small groups of people or the children. That's one way to manage that problem, because being in the middle of everything, being the person who's the storyteller or the entertainer, we may be able to kind of prop ourselves up to do that for a little while, but we're not going to be the life of the party many times. That is just not our role or our destiny in life. So finding a different way to contribute from the sidelines or just endure being there for our partner's sake occasionally might be something we need to find a way to do.
This book was written, as you said, from the perspective or for the value of the partner to the autistic individual. As a counselor, it would seem to me that the neurotypical partner, the non-autistic partner, is going to be the one who feels something is wrong or senses something is wrong. Am I reading that wrong? Or is it just as likely that the autistic person will say our relationship isn't working well?
Well, I do think more often it's definitely more often the neurotypical person who seeks help
Okay.
for couples therapy. And I do think they think something's wrong because their autistic partner is not affectionate in the typical way that they've grown to expect from their previous relationships. And the neurotypical partner may feel hurt or let down by that, and that's why they seek help. But the autistic partner also might have the sense something's wrong. It might be not as precise. They don't know exactly the outcome they would like the neurotypical person does, but they feel bereft. They're doing the best they can oftentimes in the relationship to be a good partner. Many autistic people have a lot of integrity and want to show up. They want to show that they care, but they just are living with some sense that they're letting their partner down, but they don't know what else to do. And they feel this sense of expectation and pressure, but don't know how to step up, or they don't even know what it is their partner would want different, because it's like just change who you are, right? We can't do that. None of us are capable of making radical departures from our own temperament and character, not to mention coping with these sensory difficulties we've talked about. Hearing from the neurotypical person first is most common, but I don't think that means that the autistic partner is uncaring or unaffected. They usually have at least some awareness, like, my partner's not happy, but they don't know how to take it any further than, I feel inadequate and I don't know what to do.
In addition to buying a copy of Love and Asperger's, people listening to this podcast can go visit theautistictherapist.com. What's out there on Autistic Therapist that you offer?
Now that I finished writing this book, I'm developing some online courses. And the first one is going to be for couples who either read the book or are interested in this topic, because I know not everybody wants to go to therapy or can afford therapy. Not everybody needs therapy, but I do think people need skills and tools. That's a lot of what I value about the training that I experienced through the Gottman Institute, is that this crew of scientists have been studying and observing couples, married couples, gay lesbian couples, all kinds of couple compositions for over 40 years now. And I think the wisdom of what they did there was to break down the data and identify what are the behaviors that happy couples are engaging in, and how can we package that and describe it so that all kinds of couples can learn from their experience. We're not going to just theorize and decide what we psychologists and social workers think is good. We're going to watch what real people do. So, having a set of skills that you rely on and habits that support your relationship is what I'm trying to offer. And so, I'm putting together these self study online courses so that people have access to information and can just try some experiments in their relationship and have some different ways to look at things and practice things in their relationship, because I want to make stuff that's affordable for people and that's at a place where people don't need to feel like, well, we'd better go get therapy or we have to take the plunge and go talk to a stranger about our personal problems. I don't think that's what everyone wants to do or needs to do. So I'm just trying to design some material for this population that will feel relevant and of practical value.
And again, that's at autistictherapist.com. And you're putting together those courses as we speak. They'll be available throughout this year and in the future.
That's right. Yeah.
And you also do have a private practice. You are physically located in Oregon, but you also serve clients in other states.
Yeah, the materials on the website will be for anybody because they're more along the lines of coaching or education. But the therapy that I do, I have licenses in multiple states, and people can find me at Autistic Therapist and learn more about my services. I just want to get the word out to counterbalance these places where people are getting this idea that something is wrong with the autistic partner, or the neurotypical partner has to sacrifice and struggle to manage living with this relationship they've gotten themselves saddled in with. I think that there are many really rich opportunities for people to be in relationship with someone who's different from them. We can all learn from each other and appreciate each other's differences rather than grieve them. So I want to send out the message that if you have an autistic partner, you're probably pretty lucky. That person is probably quite honest, thoughtful, reflective, may have a lot of capacities that are untapped and they don't even know about themselves. But all autistic people are thoroughly human. We're very capable of emotions, including love and affection. And I want people who have partnered with or married autistics to see the beauty and joy that's possible in their relationship.
I really like that positive message. I am trying to convey to listeners, we are valuable members of society. We are good partners and collaborators in our own way. We may collaborate and partner differently, but we certainly, I would like to think, add to the lives of others. It's a shame that there are so many assumptions that we're not interested in being partners and collaborators with the people around us.
Yeah, I think part of what I'm trying to package in this book is just the idea of, if you start looking for the cues about what's there, you're going to see more. Once you start knowing what you're looking for in your autistic partner and the positive qualities that they may have, you may be surprised at what lies beneath the surface. But for too long, for all kinds of reasons, people who work with and talk about autistics have done too much just looking at the surface. without seeing beneath, without involving autistic people themselves, thinking that they know what's best for us or thinking that they understand us by observing our behaviors. And there's a lot more at work there. And so I want to encourage people to just exercise their curiosity and be curious about our inner lives and give us a chance, because we're not Rain Man. We're not Sheldon on the Big Bang. Those are just some caricatures that were made up based on some traits that are true. That we might be a bit more careful about the way we say things, or we might be very intensely interested in certain topics, but that doesn't mean that we're lacking human qualities.
I really thank you for spreading that message. I think it's incredibly valuable to have voices like yours in the autistic community. I want to thank Kate McNulty, licensed clinical social worker and author of Love and Asperger's, for joining us on the Autistic Me podcast. Thank you very much, Miss McNulty.
It's been such a pleasure. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed our talk.
Thank you for listening to the podcast, and I hope that you do take an opportunity to visit theautistictherapist.com. Thank you for listening.
Thanks again.